Okay, you've probably heard it 1,000 times in documentaries, or maybe read it in a physics textbook. It's practically gospel in the science world at this point. Well, welcome to this explainer, because today we're going to completely rethink one of the most famously repeated historical tidbits in modern physics. We're digging right into the real unfiltered history, and honestly, it's going to change how you view one of the absolute greatest minds of the 20th century.
And here it is, the legendary quote, "Spooky action at a distance." The story goes that Einstein looked at the mind-bending concept of quantum entanglement and just completely dismissed it with this phrase. People call it the most famous insult in the history of physics. It's catchy, it's magical, but there's actually just one massive problem with this tidy little historical narrative.
Was Albert Einstein actually talking about entanglement when he said this? Well, historians of physics, the folks who actually go back into the dusty archives and read Einstein's original handwritten letters word for word, they say that this popular version of the story smooths over a much deeper, far more fascinating truth. He probably wasn't talking about entanglement at all, at least not in the way that you and I think about it today. Now, just to make sure we're all on exactly the same page before we uncover what he actually meant, let's do a super quick alignment on entanglement itself. Because, let's be real, the phenomenon truly is strange. You have two particles that share a connection across literally any distance. You measure one, and boom, the other state lines up instantly, every single time, with absolutely zero visible signal passing between them. That part of the popular story, completely true.
So, where did this famous quote actually come from then? The answer starts right here in what is essentially a historical detective story. Our primary evidence is an actual physical letter sitting in an archive right now. Picture this. It's March 3rd, 1947. Einstein sits down in Princeton and writes a highly private letter to his old friend, the physicist Max Born, over in Germany. These two have been going back and forth, arguing about the fundamental nature of quantum mechanics for over 2 decades by this point. And within that letter, we find the raw, authentic origin of the quote. Now, remember, Einstein didn't write his private letters in English. He wrote them in German. He was expressing his deep, deep frustration with the direction physics was taking. He wrote that he simply couldn't believe in the new statistical approach to quantum mechanics because physics should describe a real world, totally free of what he called spukhafte Fernwirkung. And there is your direct translation. Spukhafte Fernwirkung becomes spooky action at a distance. Notice something here. This wasn't some epic mic drop moment at a huge press conference. It wasn't published in a groundbreaking scientific paper either. The absolute, definitive origin of the catchiest phrase in physics was literally just a private grievance shared between two old colleagues in 1947. Because of that, we really need to look past the catchphrase. This letter wasn't some tidy soundbite about two entangled particles flying apart in a lab. Here is the part that completely gets dropped from the pop science narrative. Einstein was actually taking aim at the entire statistical interpretation of quantum mechanics that Max Born had helped create. He was rejecting the whole underlying philosophy of the theory, the whole shebang. Let's actually zoom out for a second and see how this builds historically. Einstein's real objection actually predates the very concept of entanglement by years. This debate traces all the way from the 1927 Solvay Conference, moves through the famous 1935 EPR paper, hits our 1947 letter, and ultimately concludes with Bell's theorem in the 1960s. We're talking about a 20-year war over the fundamental bedrock of modern physics. Let's look right at the very beginning, the 1927 Solvay Conference. And get this, it's an incredible detail. Einstein raised his worry about action at a distance 8 full years before entanglement was even formally discussed in physics. And he didn't even use two particles to make his point. He used just a single particle diffracting through a tiny hole. He was fundamentally bothered by the idea that measuring a particle in one place instantly collapsed the probability of finding it somewhere else. This perfectly illustrates the core conflict of his entire later career. When Einstein was complaining to Born in 1947, he was expressing a deep philosophical desire. He desperately wanted quantum mechanics to eventually be replaced by a fully deterministic theory of nature, something predictable, something real. That stood in absolutely stark contrast to the statistical, probability-based quantum reality that Born championed, and that, well, our universe actually seems to follow.
Which brings us to, honestly, my favorite twist in this whole explainer. 0. That is the exact number of times Albert Einstein used the word entanglement in that famous 1947 letter. Think about that. He never once mentioned the word in the very document that birthed his most famous quote about it.
In fact, to give you some context,
The word entanglement hadn't even existed for very long. It was Erwin Schrödinger who actually coined the term in German, Verschränkung, back in 1935. And Schrödinger coined it specifically in response to a really famous paper that Einstein wrote with Podolsky and Rosen that exact same year. So, without a doubt, Einstein clearly knew what the concept was. He just deliberately chose not to use it when he was complaining to Max Born.
So you've got to ask yourself, this creates a fascinating pivot in our narrative, right? If Einstein wasn't specifically targeting the phenomenon of entanglement when he coined spooky action at a distance, how in the world did the quote become so permanently glued to it in modern pop science? Like, how did the context shift so dramatically?
Well, there are a few reasons why it stuck. First off, it just fits the phenomenon perfectly, doesn't it? Entanglement is absolutely where this non-local weirdness shows up the most dramatically. But crucially, in the 1960s, John Bell figured out how to actually test these philosophical ideas in a real lab. Once Bell's theorem existed, this incredibly vivid, catchy phrase, attached to Einstein's legendary name, became the absolute perfect, obvious caption for the physics. It just felt right, so it stuck.
Now, just to clarify Einstein's actual stance here, he didn't think entanglement-style correlations were fake. He just firmly believed that particles had to carry deeper, hidden properties right from the start, which would mean quantum mechanics was incomplete. But ultimately, Bell's theorem and the subsequent experiments that actually won the 2022 Nobel Prize proved Einstein wrong. The spookiness he wanted so badly to explain away, it's a real, irreducible feature of nature.
So what's our core takeaway today? Yes, for sure, the phrase is genuinely Einstein's, but the idea that he just lazily dismissed entanglement with one cutting word completely flattens the history. Spooky wasn't his verdict on entanglement. It was his verdict on an entire interpretation of physics. He spent the entire second half of his life fighting that interpretation, and ultimately, nature decided he lost the fight.
Listen, if you want to dive deeper into this topic yourself, you absolutely do not have to take my word for it. The real, unfiltered argument is out there waiting for you. The Born-Einstein letters were published in a compilation back in 1971, complete with commentary from Max Born himself. It is a genuinely fascinating read that gives you a total front-row seat to an intellectual battle between two absolute giants of physics trying to figure out the fundamental rules of reality. And that wraps up our historical detective work for today. It just goes to show that sometimes the real story hidden away in the archives is way more interesting than the quote you see repeated in a documentary. But I want to leave you with a question to think about. Which famous science quote should we debunk next? There are plenty of myths out there just waiting to be unraveled. If you enjoyed this structured breakdown and want to keep mastering complex topics through our visual explainers, make sure you subscribe. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning what you think you know.